So what is up and coming in AI?
Oh, that is a good question. That is actually a good question. It's a simple question, but um, I think where do we start? Genuinely, the whole large language model thing came as a surprise to me. So I was at NORBS in 2022, and OpenAI was throwing a party, and it was one of many parties. It was like, oh, this weird startup there. Okay, well, I guess let's go. And I went there with a bunch of UCL people, and I mean, this is of course not like, it's not something you share all the time, but like, there was a whole bunch of really famous OpenAI people, and that are obviously now still leading the charge, in these huge, huge projects. But back then it wasn't famous, but they very strategically released a new model doing NeurIPS that made a huge impact. And you went back to NeurIPS the next year. Again, it was both times it was in New Orleans, and the world was completely changed. So large language models had taken over research. Troughs of NLP PhD students dropped this intact, theory and just went straight into transformer architectures. And I just really, really did not see that coming. And so we are still in it, I would argue. We're still in this swath there. So it's 2025 now, almost 3 years later. And of course, the people pushing for large language models, uh, more or less, obviously, of the church of scale, right? So the bigger, the better. And
Yeah.
that's very much at odds with the more classical approaches, and machine learning itself has gone actually through the same developments. I think David Barber has a story about 1996 or something, where one year NeurIPS was, about a certain topic, and then support vector machines came on the scene. And the next year, the whole conference was just support vector machines. And I think that probably, yeah, it's just the same kind of mechanism. And nowadays, support vector machines is like half an hour max in a machine learning course, on undergrad level maybe. And,
Well, maybe someone should try scaling up a support vector machine to 350 billion parameters.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And so I think that mechanism of like what's coming next is always unpredictable by design, by nature. But I think we're obviously swinging very, very much into this direction of LLMs. History says that LLMs will be commoditized. They're probably going to be, a lot of like locally run models for free, open source, and then maybe high performance models run by companies with more dedicated spaces. It's going to be a mix of that. That's just how it always is. Rarely anyone takes the whole market. And what's going to happen after that is that people will discern between applications that require high precision and then applications that are like, yeah, it can fail once in a while. Because as far as I understand, you can, just by the nature of a large language model, you can have it have, perfect verified performance. And so let's say we probably wouldn't want to shoot a rocket into the space based on LLM outputs. Neither would we
Yeah.
want to do brain surgery based on LLM outputs.
Or self-driving cars.
Yeah, it's about that tolerance of failure in applications, and they're just very clear applications, but we can't afford a single unverified predictable mistake. Of course, all applications will always be imperfect, but some of them we can write software for and procedures and models that are very predictable in their failure modes. And I think we're gonna move to a bit of a separation of these things, and this is what I focus on. So I'm very much focused on a more kind of like principled approach where where value can be shown and guaranteed on a theoretical level and evidence on a practical level. Of course, that's very at odds with the current LLM focus, which is like, I prompt it and then it gives me stuff and it looks convincing most of the time. And yeah, so we can go deeper into that, but I think we're gonna have a swing back into a more realistic perspective on LLMs and a more granular perspective on what applications benefit from LLMs and which ones do not.
Okay, so you made this comment about the church of scale, that some people
Mm,
believe that LLMs, they just need to be scaled up bigger and bigger, and then they'll be able to do everything, including perhaps even things like brain surgery or driving cars or launching rockets. And I agree that sounds pretty farcical and unlikely to happen. But there is this argument that uh, LLMs, once they get large enough and powerful enough, might not be able to drive a car, but they might be able to program a computer to drive a car.
mm.
Do you buy that argument that LLMs might finish off the job of AI?
It's so hard to imagine. But just because I can imagine it easily doesn't mean it's not possible. Is it possible? Yes. I think there's this fallacy of like again, the fallacy of like, oh, we need perfection for this to work. And the reality is humans aren't perfect, which means that all people programming self-driving cars right now are making mistakes on a daily basis. So an LLM, which is imperfect, as we all know, doesn't need to reach perfection to create value. I think if we get to a point where LLMs could be used or close to fully automated or automated to build self-driving car systems, then you'd still be left with the problem of responsibility and agency. And I don't know what our answer then would be. So I'm by principle, I don't exclude it as impossible. By my personal, maybe ignorant feeling, I think it's doesn't seem like it's gonna work. And I guess because I'm alluding to like verification, what's implicit there is of course responsibility. So I think that from a legal perspective, I think society would always want to have someone to hold responsible for. Is it going to be a person that runs the LLM that programs the self-driving cars?
I think it probably won't stand up very well in court if you say, well, I didn't program the self-driving car, the LLM
Yeah,
programmed the self-driving car. And so
yeah,
companies might be very disinclined from doing this. But I can see
yes,
the possibility that this happens gradually as people use tools like Cursor and then use it in its more agentic functions, that there's a gradual passing over of labor to LLMs until the human job is at a much more abstract level of designing the software architecture or giving high level instructions on how to improve the project or what's going wrong with the
mm,
project until at some point you just say, hey, LLM, will you build me a self driving car? And the rest follows from there. And it might not be obvious at what point the company is really running into legal issues and could be
mm.
obfuscating the where responsibility lies.
Yeah, I think so. I think on a technical basis, it's possible. Theoretically, we can all imagine it to happen. I don't
Hmm.
know, maybe there's a limit of like the molecules in the whole of universe for the compute that we require to build a system that would do that to a degree that we accept. That's also something to keep in mind, and the costs associated with running them. But let's assume that's not a concern, then I can see that that might be possible. But just to infuse my own experience, which of course is limited, is that the few times I've now tried to do machine learning and statistic and programming of these models, whenever you step outside the known distribution of like models out there, if you're trying to do something new, it just fails, and it fails pretty horribly in the sense that it suggests, well, I just did what you told me to do, and then it just did something completely different. And it will commit the most silly mistakes in machine learning, and the code will look great. And I end up having to rectify and spend more time on correcting the mistakes compared to just writing myself. That is just, of course, my own experience. Um, so I think there will be a lack of creativity because a lot of maybe self-driving systems aren't in the data set yet. So that unless, of course, we can show that LLMs have transferring abilities, um, that's not going to work for creating new kind of better self-driving systems. Again, it's just off the top of the head argument. And then the second one is also like again information theoretics. So like if it doesn't have that diversity in the data set, because we're not ever adding new kinds of different models, it's not going to be able to go outside that and create new things. And of course, that's, asking a different question. which is can LLMs be creative? Which actually brings us back to what we discussed before, right? Which was like the chemists, when they got a
Mm.
recommendation from the statistical model, they were, undermining their intuition, but they went for it and they were challenged and they learned something. When AlphaGo did the move 34 or whatever, that was all against intuition.
So you would call those creative?
Yeah, so this is the question, is that creativity, is that randomness? And I think it's probably kind of both. I think humans are uniquely creative, but also in random ways. And so I think LLMs can be creative in random ways. But is it going to be the creativity that leads to a paradigm shift in how we do things? That's up for question. I think we'll just see when it happens or not.
Yeah, yeah. I think my personal take is that LLMs
Yeah.
do clearly generalize outside of their training distribution, but not as much as we'd like. So
Mm,
they're clearly able to mix concepts together in a way that they can't have seen in their training data. Or
mm,
I've tried, like, if you just generate 20 random words and put those in as your prompts, then it comes up with a reasonable response. It doesn't go haywire. It says, "Oh, it looks like you're telling me random words. I wonder why you're doing that."
mm,
And that is out of distribution. But it's not the kind of out of distribution behavior where you're trying to create something radically new or come up with a new
mm,
idea or explanation of things. So I agree that's a pretty strong limiting factor at the moment for these AIs to be able to do research, or in particular AI research.
mm. I mean, I've had I was on a project where someone used LLMs to get inspiration for what to do next for a certain theorem and a problem. And it came up with some really good suggestions. And there's
Yeah.
nothing I can deny about that. I don't know if we would have found that one paper in any other way, but it did. Maybe we would have, Google search, you modify the keywords, you do 3 rounds, and then it comes around. But that LLM, it just was like, well, this is probably the paper you should look at for this and that reason. I was like, yeah, that's pretty spot on. Like, I can't deny that. I know you're a randomly trained machine, but simply because of the fact of the huge scale of the corpus available, it can do things that probably humans can't do. Now, then the question is, of course, at what cost? So I don't know what the current costings are, but of course, people are saying that it doesn't work out with the current pricing model. So I don't know. Like this, ultimately for me, this is something I work now on a daily basis. It's not the question of what can we do technically. It's what can we do financially? What can we afford to
Mm.
do? And so I
Hmm.
don't know where LLMs are on that scale, but that's a different question. But I don't know if you have opinions on that.
Yeah, so it might be the case that in order to get a good response from an AI, you need to generate 1,000 or 100,000 responses and then get it to select what it thinks is the best one, which is a technique that does work surprisingly. Um, and then this leads to techniques like, okay, that's a way of generating synthetic training data to train a better model for the next stage. So I think I agree that while it's technically possible, it might come at enormous compute costs. And so maybe we shouldn't expect this to happen in the next 2 years. Um, but do you see fundamental limits to creating human level or beyond intelligence, not necessarily through LLMs, but through any technique?
Hmm. I mean, you can be overly philosophical about this and ask the question, what is intelligence? But I don't think that's going to be productive here because I think neither the Greek philosophers nor us really know what intelligence is. And it might even be a very political thing anyway, right? Because as soon
Yeah.
as I can say I'm more intelligent than you, then somehow that buys me like authority. And I don't think that's true. I think intelligence comes in very different shapes and forms. Emotional intelligence is something that people very much accept as like something that some people have and some people don't. And so, can you train emotional intelligence to a machine? I guess to some degree. I mean, there's plenty of cases where, people are falling in love with large language models. In fact, that is something I've discussed with philosophers who asked that question way before it was on the
Yeah.
news. And it can be easily shown how you can push a large language models to behave like, a romantic partner. And I would consider probably emotional intelligence. And if some people say, well, that's actually enough for me, then job is done, right? So like, yes, can you get to human level intelligence? I think for certain subtasks. And then the question is, can you get it to do that for a well-rounded human, and that's obviously a heuristic because again, humans in one way are differently talented and then also differently trained. So just because you're talented doesn't mean you have refined your talent. And the same is for an LLM, I think. So having said that, I think that it is in principle possible to get to a perception as if it was of human intelligence. And that's where we have to go from the other direction. As humans, maybe we're all just stochastic parrots as well. The classic arguments against LLMs is that they're just stochastic parrots and they just parrot what they've seen before, just on a huge scale. Who says that's not what humans are doing? Let's be honest, slight swipe, but the Oxford essay system trains people to, fake intelligence about certain topics that they might not have even written a paper about. And so that is something that's being trained and that some people can do really well. Bullshitting, not just something LLMs do, it's something that obviously humans did first. So whoever did that more convincingly is perceived as intelligent. I think, this definitely should be a back and forth, but just the last point here is, of course, um, does the LLM have a deep systematic understanding of the world, let's say physical rule base, like a human does? And I think that's yet to be shown. And yeah, so that's a question.
Yeah, I agree that the emotional intelligence does not seem to be where LLMs are currently lacking, given that people go to
Yeah.
them for advice on things like, oh, what should I write in my best man speech or my
Mm,
letter to my partner on Valentine's Day or whatever. They seem to do quite a much better job than us at that kind of task. Um, but on the question of stochastic parrots, I think I would say that neither humans nor LLMs are stochastic parrots. There's some evidence that
okay.
LLMs do some kind of planning ahead to figure out what tokens to write. So, for example, in poetry, they might plan ahead what word will rhyme and then fill in the rest of the line in order to get to that word. There's some evidence that they
Mm,
do that kind of thing. And then
yeah.
humans, in my opinion, are theory driven in how they talk and think about the world. Like you were saying, we have world models and we reason using those. Um, so I'd be very reluctant to call us a stochastic parrot, but maybe you could stretch the definition of stochastic parrot to fit in very complex
Well, yeah.
stochastic processes.
Yes.
Yeah, that contain world models.
Yeah. So, like, does a stochastic parrot have to have a world model to be a parrot or not? And I think, yeah, I mean, so the very deep questions here, and this is again something people can do a whole PhD in career about, is if you have enough data, is prediction causality, right? If you've seen all possible versions of the world or an approximate subset of that, can you generalize to all possible causal states, right? Because when we say world model, it kind of implicitly says a causal model of the world as well, right? I shoot a gun while a projectile flies out. Like that's a causal understanding. It's a world model. So that's a question there to answer. Um, and so because an argument against LLMs having a world model is that, well, it's just all associations. Well, yeah, but maybe it's a lot of associations. It's close enough that it looks like a causal inspired world model, and it can reason about that. So that's a possibility. Again, we shouldn't exclude that from the beginning up front.
I don't think we could ever get enough data to say that only by associations you could get a world model because the world is
Mm,
constantly changing and there's too much of the world to model in its
yeah.
entirety. But I think there's maybe just enough evidence to say that they have very primitive models of certain things. So for example, if you ask what's bigger, a cup or an elephant, then
Mm,
I would guess that there's just too many pairwise comparisons for it to have seen all of them. And so it probably has some kind of latent variable representing height or size or weight of each object, and then is able to do new pairwise comparisons it's not seen before by looking
mm,
up its internal representation and comparing those. Now, that's a complete guess. I've got no idea whether something like that is
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
going on in LLMs, but it's something that could be learned through associations only, and yet in deployment time is not based on associations.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Absolutely. And I guess obviously to be realistic here, of course, philosophy is not driving these developments. Philosophy is, trying to put some kind of like framework around this.
Yeah.
People at the very forefront of LLMs are driving these developments. And of course, they will have these thoughts as well, but they're more busy optimizing tensor, products and so forth. And
Tuning hyperparameters.
yeah, exactly. And so like there's a whole range of people very focused about certain questions along this whole value chain. And everyone will have their limited understanding. But the reality is that definitely, we have a huge allocation of resources in this decade onto large language models. And so we're going to see very many new things there. But coming back to your question before of what's next in AI? Well, we're still in the middle of this huge wave, and by dictation of history, this wave will crash. Maybe not like dramatically, catastrophically. It will just come down and we'll kind of probably max out on a few things. Of course, some voices say no. In fact, it could be a runaway kind of thing, but I'm skeptical of that just based on tuition. And yeah, so no one knows what will come out, what will come after this, but I think for what it's worth, it's obviously extremely exciting. Yeah.
Mm. So, what one way of formulating this idea of like, could it be as intelligent as a human that perhaps doesn't come with uncomfortable political questions, would be this idea of a Turing test, where you're not
Mm,
just having a chat with the computer or human, but setting the computer or human tasks to do,
mm,
cognitive tasks that can be verified just through a terminal, a computer screen with text and maybe access to the internet and stuff. And then I could see that, well, for one, that this allows you to verify many more things than the original Turing test, where it's just chats and you can ask it to write programs or to correct a document or to email some people or whatever. Um, but it's also much closer to real world impact of what are we going to want to actually use these AIs for, presumably to do
mm.
cognitive labor that can be done solely with access to a computer. So I'm not sure LLMs are going to take us to that. I think it's possible.
Mm.
But do you see any obstacle, like philosophical obstacle to creating AIs that are able to do any cognitive task a human can do on a computer?
So there's one thought that came to my mind right now, and I want to also make sure I answer your actual question. Um, but I think I will just lead with that, which is that in science, you know, we all have a roughly same understanding of what science is supposed to do, which is like kind of like have a hypothesis and test it and increase the understanding and create models that somewhat accurately predicts the future of what's going to happen, when I shoot a rocket into space and so forth. But that scientific paradigm of tests can also be applied to your question. And so I think that ultimately we don't really have, on a philosophical level, a test that can decide whether, an LLM succeeds or not. So what I'm trying to say is that, like, I think it's a very likely scenario that we will apply LLMs to these kind of tasks, and they will do them, and sometimes they will suck. But like for whatever way the world is structured in resource and economic and finance, we'll keep pushing into this and we'll find ourselves in a place where we're like, well, that's just what LLMs do. We assign them these tasks and sometimes it breaks. But it is widely accepted knowledge that that's the more efficient thing to do, even though it isn't. It's just we kind of like find ourselves trapped into that because we don't really have an alternative or we don't remember an alternative, like especially if we have such a huge wave of LLMs just coming around and being integrated in everything. I can see a scenario where we're just gonna like integrate them so hard that like going out going away from them is going to be hard. Um, and so we kind of like find ourselves stuck there in a suboptimal space just because it's more convenient and just because we can actually test and verify that the way we did it before was better. Because,
Mm.
well, how do you test it? Like, do you count the dollar money that was saved? I don't think we have enough measures. And again, this is a philosophical and statistical argument. We would need counterfactual argument, right? We need to run the world without LLMs and run the world with LLMs and then compare how they're doing. And we simply can't do that. We're obviously now in the LLM strand of reality.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
I don't think it's a question of can they do that or can they replace that. I think it's a question of can we even test whether that replacement was successful or not. And I don't think we can sufficiently do that. What we have right now, again, is can be historically shown, the same with electricity and railways, is that you have a huge industry wave of adoption where suddenly budget holders will just, sign off on millions of dollars for LLMs just because my buddies did so too over there, and I don't want to lose my job because I missed out on this thing. So now everyone is trying these things. In industry, you can be cynical about this and be like, industry, is just not verifying this. You can be positive about this and be like, industry is putting up all this money to experiment and see if it works or not, right? That's wonderful, right? So now we can all test this. I just don't know if these experiments have actually proper validation that can show us whether it works or not. So I think people are hugely split, whether cursor and LLM programming is making things better or worse. Because from my personal experience, of course, in a very specialized coding setting, it makes things worse. So I wouldn't use it. But then again, if I was running a, consultancy, an agency, which has rudimentary tasks on a computer, and I can have a junior software engineer run 5 things in parallel, right? This vibe coding kind of thing. And I feel convinced that it improves my bottom line on profit. Then I might go for that. But actually, I might create software that's completely unmaintainable in 2 years' time.
Mm. Hmm.
Whereas if you had a dedicated team of 5, software junior engineers that would grow with that, and in 2 years' time, they would know the intricacies and all the mistakes and all the bugs that exist. So it's really hard to tell. Our evaluation periods just simply aren't long enough to make any statement about that. So, the answer is I don't know. But I think the risk much higher than like, oh, maybe they can't do that is maybe more like maybe we think they can do that, and then we find ourselves in a suboptimal space. And I think people that do find a test to figure out where it works and where it doesn't are the ones that are actually gonna ultimately prevail.
I see. So if I can echo that back to see if I understand, the
Yeah.
original Turing test was just language based, and
Mm,
that's a problem because you can't tell whether the AI can actually do tasks or do labor.
mm,
And then I propose, well, it's not my idea, but there's this idea of the Turing test where it's able to do cognitive tasks. Perhaps for you run it for an hour and see whether it's better or worse than a human. And yes, that's better. You can see whether it can do certain tasks or not. But the real impact comes from long-term adoption of these
mm.
systems throughout the economy. And to see whether that would actually be as good as humans or better, you'd have to do a proper controlled experiment where you run some companies with lots of integrated
Yeah,
AI and some companies without.
yeah. And no one's gonna do that.
No one's going to do that.
um,
Well, I mean,
yeah.
you mentioned that you're using it for coding and you haven't found it helpful. I've used it for coding and I have found it very helpful. So we're already
Mm.
running some proper controlled. Well, maybe they're not. Yeah. Well, they are controlled, yeah, because we used to not use it and now we do use it.
Yeah, so experiments are being run not in the most principled way. So like obviously we have confounding factors, but because presumably the tasks that you used it on were different to mine. So like is it comparable the results? Hard to tell. Does it have to be perfect? No. Will we emerge in 5 years with an understanding of what LLMs can do or not? Certainly. Is that understanding based in an accurate representation of what it is? I don't think so. I think there's going to be a lot of like, again, the wave pushes forward, then it falls down and we kind of like really stagnate in that place because people will move on and do different things and have different priorities. And they will just be like, well, no, we're just an industry that does LLMs. It's the same with pharma. Like, pharma has gone through these waves of like computational chemistry, and then it comes through and everyone does it, and then it breaks down, and then you have all these people trained in computational chemistry, and that's what they do, and then that's what they continue doing. Even though we don't have a factual, like, complete understanding of whether computational chemistry actually improves the drug discovery process or not. It's just we know we did this back then. We spent a lot of money. And maybe it's also like a sunk cost fallacy kind of thing. So
It's not necessarily a fallacy. If you've hired 100 computational chemical engineers, to go back to the previous method would require firing them and hiring a bunch of new people. So switching back really would come with huge costs.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a really good argument, but let's say 2030, we're all going to look at, what pieces are left of LLMs and which things have shown, just to work. And I think uh, uh, more than not, it's going to be things that are cheap, reliable, robust, not the best, but it's just kind of like it does the job. And so I think that's a big argument against this kind of like big approaches with big models. Because again, no one has an understanding whether they're financially viable or not. And we're going to see that, of course, maybe, graphic chips and software develops ever further, that it does become cheaper and cheaper. We also have great evidence for that. Solar cells were hugely expensive. Now they're hugely cheap. Of course, we'd wish that that would be the case for that, but there are limits. And some, that there's no indication of where these limits will be found. No one does know that for the time being. We're all having great fun playing with LLMs.
Yeah, this is quite a sad argument that I've not really heard before, that we might end up adopting these systems large scale, even though they could possibly be worse in many ways, simply due to the hype and the
Yeah,
massively deflated prices that these systems are being offered at, which will presumably rise
yeah,
once a bunch of them go bust and we're left with a monopoly. Um, but I suppose
right.
another reason why you might expect widespread adoption, even if it's worse, is because these companies might be able to continue offering these systems below the cost it takes to run them, because they gather so much user data, or could be used to gather so much user data, that could
Mm,
be then used for targeted advertising or sold to other
yeah.
companies that do targeted advertising. So I've just finished Edward Snowden's book, and it's maybe very suspicious of WhatsApp being end-to-end encrypted, but still the metadata must hold so much rich information, if you know how to extract it, that it's worth
Mm,
it for them to run the company just to extract that metadata and then sell it on. I assume that's what they're doing. I don't know whether that's their business model. But it could be a similar thing with LLMs, where most people don't know to turn off the memory when they first start using it, so it doesn't
mm,
start memorizing a bunch of facts about them, or turn off the
yeah.
improve model for others toggle, which basically means they can train on your data and do whatever they want with it. So this could be the business model, even if the systems are not useful, or not more useful than humans. If they can be offered at exceptionally low prices, that means,
Yeah,
well, okay, maybe if I
absolutely.
employ 10 of them rather than one human, then it is worth it.
Yeah. So I mean, it could, monetization of LLMs will happen 100%, whether they can be run, at cost or not. It doesn't matter whether they're cheap or not. It's unavoidable with human nature that they're going to find a way
Mm.
to make money with this. And of course, there's great fun jokes out there already, of course, where you ask them how do I bake a brownie, and then it's like, oh, you need flour and this, and I really highly recommend that you use flower XYZ because it has these properties, sponsored by hashtag whatever, And it's like we can all see that, and I think, yeah, it would definitely happen. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't happen. It's we live in the 21st century where you are the product and you are being sold on to advertisers, and of course, someone like Google should be really worried, because OpenAI has a huge market share. And that is hugely problematic because Google is heavily, heavily, monolithic on its revenue streams with ads. And the less people use Google, the less money they make. And that they know that. They've done that scenario. So yeah, we'll see LLMs with advertisements. It's going to be incredibly funny. And yeah, so
And
no
frustrating.
question. And frustrating, huh?
Well, on that bleak end, maybe I should ask you what kind of positive things you expect to see in the next 10 years in the field of AI.
What positive things do I see in the field of AI? I think what I've been blown away is by how fast it's developing. And if you do get the chance, to do a PhD in machine learning, I think it's great to see just how the deep community is incredibly nice and incredibly supportive. And I think I would hope that will, despite this whole hype of LLMs and huge amounts of money going into it, that I think we'll also continue to see the machine learning community pushing against that immediate gratification and trying to, work for better results that aren't based on, funded by ads, but funded by people just, wanting to improve the world around them. And so, I mean, there's the machine learning summer school, which has been hugely influential for my journey. All the conferences are a great place. Of course, hugely confounding with all the, vendors and companies coming to try to recruit you, but then also lots of conversations with people who are just generally trying to make a positive change. And I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that that will continue to be so. So it's a very kind of like contrarian point. It's not technical at all.
Hmm.
I don't think we're gonna, like I think the technical things will write themselves, but I think the human side of it doesn't. And I think that's something where everyone can make a contribution and be charitable, entertain other people's arguments, don't be a LLM Luddite, LLM bad, I will not touch them. That's not productive, being open-minded is important here. And the machine learning community, and I'm talking here specifically, about like centers like Alice in Europe, and the people associated with that have a great chance and a great responsibility to make a difference there through the conferences. I mean, there's massive amounts of travel funding, to make sure that everyone can participate. I
Hmm.
think that we'll probably see more diverse locations for research conferences. In fact, myself, I'm, kind of like investing in that. So I started kind of like basically kind of like tiny micro charity where I support students in Ghana for research simply because I've worked with them before and
Hmm.
have seen that the only thing they lack is resources and training. So I would hope that we can, in the next 10 years in AI, create more level playing field for the talents out there. Because, well, where do great things like LLMs come from? Well, they come from very smart people. And smart people, as far as I understand, are uniformly distributed around the planet. And right now, we're like hugely underfunding uh, talent pools all across the world. So, um, that is, I think, is a focus point. That is what I want to focus on. That's what I'm looking forward to see develop more. So it's called active learning grants.
Where can people go to find that? Just Google that.
It's just Active Learning Grants is a conference as well, actually, that I'm running later in November and where I highlight that. But it's on Matterhorn Studio, or just send me a message. And that's kind of like the push I go for. I think that's actually, I'm very happy to end it on that sense because, I think that's the deeper change at hand. And so I think we're going to see more, you know, power to the people. Um, through open source compared to the huge power grab that's happening right now through insane amounts of money and resource allocation.
Yeah, well, it's such an insane amount of money that it can't go on for much longer. This may be the maybe the silver lining. Exciting times of the next 2 to 5 years, or however long it takes to dry up the funding or exhaust the
Yes.
VCs.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great chatting to you, Jakob. I'm glad we've got a new benchmark to see whether LLMs or Bayesian inference comes on top with who comes up with the better brownie recipes or mojito cocktail recipes.
Literally, I'm sure someone's working on that right now.
All right, thanks for coming on, Jakob.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.